Today I'm going to be building an in-ground mini pond, primarily for wildlife purposes. It shall be including a mini bog filter, plants, both aquatic and terrestrial, plus much more. And this little forgotten corner of the garden is where that pond shall be situated. This is what I'm going to be using for the pond itself, a 150 litre or 40 gallon pre-formed pond liner. And the first thing I'm going to do is to clear the area, starting with this old sink that I've been using as a planter. I then got rid of these few bricks, followed by a few old slabs. With all that moved though, I did a bit of weeding and then dug out the old sand that was under the slabs, which I am going to be holding on to for later on in the project. I then had a little sweep and did some cable management, which are in fact the cables from my DIY pond that I built last summer, which by the way is looking particularly good right now. Anyway, with the cables tidied, it was time to start taking up these old bricks, which wasn't the easiest, but I persevered. Once done, the area was prepped and ready to go. So the next thing I need to do now is to bring in the preformed pond liner and have a little play around with it to decide on its exact location, whilst being conscious of the fact that I am going to be adding some terrestrial plants around the pond later. So I do need to bear that in mind. But yeah, once I had decided on its position, because I don't have any spray paint to mark it with, I'm just going to kind of use my hand to mark the soil, which should be fine. And yeah, that has marked our pond location well. Therefore, it is time to break ground and start digging. Now, the digging took a while and I did find it pretty difficult to get the shape just right to fit the pond. I've never fitted one of these before and it was definitely harder than I thought it was going to be. But after a fair amount of moving the pond in, then out again, then doing a bit more digging, I did eventually have the pond in position. And with that done, I took it out one last time, or at least what I was hoping would be the last time, and added some sand to the bottom of the hole, which is going to both add a layer of protection and also allow us to get the pond nice and level. So with the pond in and the levels checked, it was time to grab the sand that I dug out earlier and start backfilling. And it was whilst doing this backfilling that I realised I really should have overdug the hole more, because I was finding it really quite difficult to get the sand into all the gaps. So much so, I did end up having to get the pond back out so I could rework the shelves. Now this did take a while, but it was well worth it. Once the pond was finally back into position, it was solid, level, and ready to move on to the next step, which was to bring back some of the bricks that I had previously taken up and add them around the edge of the pond. This is because, as you can see, the pond is in fact very slightly raised above ground level. And I've done this on purpose because by having it just slightly raised, it's going to stop stuff getting washed into the pond when it rains. The bricks I'm using are just going to help keep the pond edges nice and solid. With that done though, things are looking good. And what I want to do next is to just break up the compacted soil around the pond, because I am going to be later planting into that. I did also end up bringing back some of the soil that I dug out earlier, just to bring the soil line up to the right level. And then added some gravel down this little edge here, and that's just because I'm not planning on planting this little bit, so by adding gravel it will help a little bit with drainage. With that done, it was looking tidy and we're ready to start adding some of the hardscape to the pond itself. This is some of the hardscape I have available. Not only various branches, but also this big rock and some pretty cool looking pieces of bark. Also got little Oz here, he's keeping an eye on things, kind of in a supervisory capacity. The first thing I'm going to focus on though is some of these larger branches which I'm using as exit points for frogs, toads, newts or any other small animals to be able to get out of the pond easily. Now the only issue with adding branches like this to the pond is they can release tannins into the water, which can give it that kind of tea-stained colour. Not a huge issue and it shouldn't last forever, but it is something I probably wouldn't do if this was more of a fish pond. But seeing as though it is primarily for wildlife, having some decomposing wood can actually be a good thing. For example, it can provide a good area for dragonfly to lay their eggs. But yeah, that is something to bear in mind. If you don't want that tannin look, you could instead use some rocks piled up to create a little ramp, just something that small animals can use to get themselves out of the pond. So as you've seen, I've had a bit of a play around with the positioning of these branches. Once I had decided on the branches I was going to be using, I gave them a good rinsing off. Then, before adding them back to the pond, I had a little vacuum out of the sand and debris that had fallen in, and also had a quick wipe round. Once that was done, I placed the branches back, and what I'm going to move on to now is some terrestrial planting around the pond. And I've got a good variety of plants available. Some I bought specifically for this little project, but a lot of them I got for free from my mum out of her garden, and I've stuck to mainly shade tolerant plants because Where the pond is situated is quite a shady little spot, and I'm going to start by just placing them around the pond, taking my time, just try to work out what will look good where. Once I've decided on the layout, I gave them all a good soak because they were quite dry, and then I'm starting planting with this little hosta. Now I've got a few of these hostas to go around the pond, which were all free, and they should do well because they are a pretty shade tolerant plant. I've then got this pyracantha, which I got from my local garden centre, and it said on the label, ideal for shady walls and fences, so hopefully it should do well here. And I've got it at the back as I think it can get reasonably big. With that in though, next up I've got a fern, which is a classic shade loving plant, so I'm putting it in here as this is probably the most shady spot in this little area. I've then got this ornamental grass plant and a couple more hostas. I've then got this little conifer, which I'm going to put in here up against the wall, and then this boxwood, which I'm going to just pop in the middle here. I've then got this iris, which will soon be displaying a beautiful purple flower, and another good sized clump of hosta, which has been somewhat attacked by slugs, but I'm hoping once the frogs and toads make their way over to the pond, they will be taken care of. Finally, I've got a nice trio of creeping jenny, which will not only grow well outside of the pond, but may well make its way over into the margins of the pond and send down roots into the water, which is good for water quality and will also, over time, help soften the edges of the pond. And with the terrestrial plants done, that has made a big difference. But what I'm going to do now is to use this big rock that I found, and I'm going to use it for holding down this wood because otherwise it will probably float once we add water. And to hold down the second piece, I'm going to just pop in a stake next to it, then whack in a couple of screws to hold it in position. And with that done, I'm going to give all the plants that I've just put in a good old watering. So with all the plants nicely watered in, I'm going to grab some landscape bark chippings or mulch type stuff. I'm going to add it all around the plants. This is going to help in both retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. It's also going to look cool and just finish off the terrestrial planting nicely. With that done, we need to cover the edges of the pond, and for that I'm going to be using some slate. Welsh slate to be precise, and I picked this up from my local garden centre, and I tried to get a good variety of different shapes and sizes. And once I got them back home, it was time to start placing them around the edge of the pond. And what I'm doing is using some of the stones and a bit more of the mulch just to make sure the slate pieces are nice and solid. So with the slate all in position, I brought in some of the pieces of bark, just to break up the slate and try and make the area look a little bit more natural and just generally wildlifey. Next up, I grabbed one of the branches that I had left over and cut off a little piece, which I'm going to position at the back here, coming out over the pond, and this is going to act as a dragonfly perch, because apparently the male dragonfly like to perch just above the pond, and I think this is because they like to keep an eye on their little territory, and yeah, as you can see, I just kind of secured it in place with a rock. So with the dragonflies taken care of, I grabbed an old broken plant pot, which I'm using to make a little frog house, which I popped in at the back here. And then used a bit of slate to cover the hole and hold it in position. And I am really hoping I'm going to come out here one day and see a little frog poking his little head out of that cave. But yeah, with the waterfront housing in place, I used a bit more of this conveniently shaped bark to cover the cables at the back here. And now, standing back, things are starting to look good. You may notice though, the gap at the back there, and this has been left for our filtration. Now whilst a powered filtration system on a wildlife pond isn't essential, it is something that I would like to include. And for that, I'll be using this mini waterfall filter. but I want to run it as a small bog filter. So instead of using the sponges that came with the filter, I'm going to be using rock, gravel and plants instead. So starting with these large rocks that I'm going to pop in at the bottom here, I'm then going to add some slightly smaller river rocks, followed by some 10mm pea gravel, which later on, once the filter is in its final position and running, we can add plants to. And how this little filter will work is, the water will be pumped from the pond into the bottom of the filter. It will then slowly move up through the various layers of rock and gravel, and in the process being both biologically and somewhat mechanically filtered before returning back to the pond. So if we have a quick look at the back of the filter here, you can see I've added a little 90-degree elbow. That's just to stop the pond hose from kinking. Then I've also had to add a little reducer here, and that is because the small pump that I'm going to be using requires smaller hosing. So just to let you know, that's why I've added that. With that done though, our filtration is not yet complete because I want to add a pre-filter for the pump to sit in. And for that, I'll be using this small plastic planter that I just had lying around. And I'm going to start by adding this bit of sponge that actually came with the waterfall filter. And what this is going to do is, it's just going to hold the pump in place and help cut down on vibrations. With that in though, and the pump in position, I grabbed the scrap piece of coarse sponge that I had lying around. And it is important it is coarse because otherwise it will clog too quickly, and cut it to size. And after adding a little hole, I can push my hosing from my little bog filter through the sponge, connect it to the pump, and place the sponge inside our little pre-filter. The water will now be mechanically filtered before heading over to our bog filter, where it will be biologically filtered before returning back to the pond via the little waterfall, which will also add oxygen through surface agitation. The pre-filter will also prevent any little critters from getting sucked up into the pump and help reduce both pump and bog filter maintenance. And as you can see, I've now moved the bog filter into position, trying to get it as level as possible. I then added my little pre-filter with the pump inside to this shelf here, nice and close to the bog filter, which I've done intentionally because this is a wildlife pond, so I don't want to create too much flow or water movement, which is actually the opposite of what you would normally do if this was a fish pond. But yeah, with that in place, I checked the length of the hosing, cut it to the right length, before using a hose clamp to fix into position. I then just added this stone to the top of the pre-filter to hold it in place. And with all that done, I went about using a few more bits of slate and a couple of rocks around the waterfall bog filter just to conceal the plastic and make it look a bit more natural. But whilst to do that, I thought I'd take a minute to talk about the maintenance of this little filtration system, which will include the occasional rinse out of the pre-filter sponge, and then I estimate maybe a yearly full breakdown of the actual mini bog filter itself, probably at the beginning of spring, where all the rocks and gravel can be removed and any muck that may have settled at the bottom cleaned out. I'll probably use my pond vac for this, then all put back together and planted up, ready for the season ahead. Time will tell on that though, but no doubt I'll do an update video once it's been up and running for a few months, so don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see that. With our little filtration system done though, next up I'm going to add some plants inside the pond, starting with a mini water lily, which is currently sat in a little storage tub. So I'm going to grab it out of here and add it to this front part of the pond, because this is the area of the pond that is going to be getting the most sunlight. And with the water lily in, I've got another couple of plants that I'm going to add to the bottom of the pond, which are currently being stored in my above ground mini pond here. And first up, I've got water milfoil, which I'm just going to pop in here, followed by some mare's tail, and I decided to just leave these in the plastic baskets they came in, as they seem to be growing well in there, and because of the holes in the baskets, they will be able to send their roots out into the pond, which will create little habitats for any little critters that may decide to come and call this pond home. Next up though, it's time to add some substrate, and I'm starting by adding a base layer of aquatic potting mix. This is going to provide nutrients for any plants that we may decide to add in later on. And as I'm adding it in, I'm going to really try and push it down, and that's just to get rid of any air pockets. And with our nutrient layer down, to cap it off, I'm going to add a couple of inches of this, which is a mix of fine sand, coarse sand and pea gravel. And this is going to lock down that aquatic potting mix and prevent any nutrients from floating off into the water column and potentially causing a big old algae bloom. And with that done, I hooked up my hose to my water butt, brought it over to the pond and started filling. And with the water in, it's time to add some more plants. Starting with some starwort, which I've been storing in my little container here. And whilst I believe this is a stem plant and therefore can be planted directly into the substrate, I found it also does well just floated. So yeah, I planted some into the substrate and I'm going to just leave some floating. Next up, I've got a variety of different marginal plants which annoyingly came in these solid plastic containers. I'm going to repot them up using more aquatic style planters that are made of a mesh construction. This will allow for better water flow through the roots and long term also allow the roots to grow out of the pot and into the pond, allowing them to pull nutrients directly from the water column and therefore promoting better water quality and helping to reduce algae, whilst at the same time providing habitat for various pond inhabitants. Now, as you can see, I'm leaving them in the aquatic soil they came in and even adding a little bit more where needed, which is not what I would do if I was to be adding these plants to my goldfish pond. If I was to be adding these plants to my goldfish pond, I'd be washing all this soil off and planting in just gravel, which would force the plants to pull the nutrients they require from the water column created by the fish waste. This pond, however, isn't going to have any fish producing waste to feed the plants, so aquatic soil is needed. As you've seen though, I have used Hessian to line the planters and cap the aquatic soil with my sand gravel mix, which should hopefully prevent too much nutrients from the soil leaching out into the pond. So with the marginal plants repotted, I could start adding them to the pond, starting with this nice water iris, and this should later on in the season show off some nice purple flowers, which will be nice. And to go next to that, I've got some sea rush. Pretty cool, looks kind of like grass. I've then got some horsetail, which is one of my favourite pond plants. In fact, I think I've got a bit of this in all of my ponds. And then to go next to that, I've got some water mint, which I've heard can be a bit invasive, so I'll be keeping an eye on that. But yeah, this should also display a nice little purple flower in the not too distant future. And then finally, on the marginal plant front, I've got some typha. And I did upgrade the size of the pot for this plant when I repotted, because this plant can get big with a big root structure. Plus the shelf was big enough to fit a bigger pot, so I thought, why not? Also, you may have noticed the shelf here at the front is a little bit lower, which is absolutely fine for typha. And with our marginal plants all in, it was time to add some floating plants, starting with some hornwort. And I've only got a little bit here, but it will soon grow. And this is a great plant for wildlife ponds, especially handy if you don't have a powered filter, because it will act as like a natural filter. And on top of that, it is also an oxygenating plant. So yeah, overall, a really great plant for a wildlife pond. Next up though, I've got some water soldier. This will float just below the water surface during the spring and summer, and then over the winter will drop down to the bottom before floating back up the following spring. I've then got some frog pit that floats on the surface, and in a similar way to the water soldier, will drop down to the bottom over the winter and rise back up in the spring. Next up though, I've got some creeping jenny, and I'm going to rinse all the soil off the roots before planting it in our little mini bog filter. And the reason I've gone for creeping jenny in here is because it doesn't get too big and it doesn't have a massive root structure, and so it shouldn't clog up the bog, and therefore keeps maintenance to a minimum. With that in though, and our bog filter running, I placed a couple of rocks on the spillway just to break the water up a bit, which increases the water agitation and therefore adds a bit more oxygen to the water column. As you can see though, it is a very slow flow, which is ideal for not just the bog filter, which works best with a slow flow of water moving through the rock and gravel, but also, as I mentioned earlier, wildlife does generally prefer still or very slow flowing water. And with our mini bog filter now flowing and a couple of days having passed, we already have our first visitor, and hopefully permanent resident to the pond. And it is a toad, the common toad, or bufo as it is scientifically known. And that is crazy. Within a couple of days we already have a resident toad. So with the wildlife already moving in, I have got a couple of finishing touches I want to do, starting with adding a little bit of moss that I just found in the garden to this little shelf here, because I noticed it seemed to be staying damp, so I thought a small piece of moss should grow nicely in there. I then added some water lettuce, water chestnut, and some red-stemmed parrot's feather, along with a little bit of curly pondweed, which is a good shade-tolerant oxygenating plant that can go directly into the substrate. And with all that done, and a couple of weeks having now passed, plants are growing in nicely. And as more time goes by, the ecosystem will continue to mature and welcome in more and more wildlife. That is going to bring us to the end of this one though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.